Hi folks, it's Des Pheby again, and welcome to the next episode of the Franchise Entrepreneur. And today's episode we're going to talk about the very exciting subject of property in relation to your franchise agreement. So prepare yourself to be excited and flabbergasted. Okay, so as I said, property is not probably the most exciting subject in the world on the franchising side, and certainly not something that I get terribly excited by, but it is something that's very important within the whole franchising experience and could potentially come back and bite you in the backside if you don't get it right. Now, a few things that you need to consider right at the beginning, and one of them is who is going to be on the lease. Is it going to be you, or is it going to be your franchisee? Now, you might think that's a fairly obvious answer, i.e. the franchisee is going to be on it because you don't want the potential debt exposure. Now, that's not always a good idea for a number of reasons. Certainly from one of my brand's perspectives, we tend to be on more of the leases than not, and the reasons for that are quite simple. We've had a look at Subway's model, we looked at Papa John's, and we noticed that they tended to be on a lot of their leases and then sublet to their franchisee. Now, the reason for that is that you can build more protections within your franchise agreement that make it easier to control the franchise if they go into dispute with you or go rogue. So for example, you're on the leash, you sublet to the franchisee doesn't pay you your fees or doesn't pay you the rent. It's much easier for you to step in relatively quickly and painlessly and operate that store and effectively move them out of it and then deal with that afterwards. Whereas if you're only reliant on your franchise agreement, although you've got protections there, it tends to go into a more of a legal wrangle with solicitors, and potentially they could carry on operating for a period of time, and quite a significant period of time, until that's resolved. This kind of circumvents that pretty quickly, because you are effectively their landlord. If they don't pay the rent, and if they don't pay you, or if they pay you the rent, thinking that they've got some sort of protection there, but they don't pay you your fee, as long as you've got your franchise agreement linked in with the property, then they will effectively go into breach of both their franchise agreement, which will enable you to take control of the store if you need it to be. Obviously you want to avoid that, but you've got to build in these kind of protections. So that's a big advantage. There's also a number of other advantages as well. You could also see it as potentially adding a revenue to your business, because there's the potential to pay the landlord one rent and charge a different rent. So it may be that the property is bigger than you need for operating your particular business, and you can subdivide it and then rent out the other part of it. Or quite often with most properties there are dead spaces. So for instance, we have a number of properties where we utilise the downstairs very well, but the upstairs is basically dead space. It's not getting used for anything. You could potentially convert that into either accommodation if it's a long lease and you're prepared to spend the money on conversion, or you could rent it out as office space or even another business. So there's some options there that you might have in terms of adding an additional revenue stream to it. In terms of going on to the disadvantages are obviously you are exposed to the debt. If the tenant does not pay the rent, then it falls back on you to pay it. And it may well be a property that is not doing particularly well. You know, the circumstances, that the location has changed, it's maybe a big redevelopment of the area and it's affected that particular location, and it's no longer a viable store and you don't want it, and you may be left with that. So you've got some potential there for debt, etc. Now, one of the other things to take into account is that you may not have a choice. So this isn't necessarily about you having a choice as well. the landlord may insist on the mother company, i.e. the franchisor, acting as some sort of guarantor. That's quite common. You may not have a choice. You then have to make a commercial decision on whether you really believe that the location is going to be a good location for the duration of your lease, and potentially build some safety measures in place, so i.e. break clauses, etc. Now, the point is that if the tenant or your franchisee's covenant is not strong enough, which quite often is the case because they are a new company, they may have well set up a new company, they may not have any business track record, and therefore the landlord quite rightly will probably want some sort of security behind it. So if there's not a personal guarantee that they've given, or it may well be that they have given a personal guarantee, but in addition to that they want the guarantee from the master franchise or the founders of the franchise. So you may not have a choice. The next point is, within your franchise agreement, it's really important that has sections in it that relate directly back to your sublease or your underletting to the franchisee. So in the event that there is a failure or a breach of paying not only the rent but also the franchise fee, that you have the option to take the store back and operate it, regardless of whether they are actually on the lease. So let's say, for example, that you're not on the lease at all, they're on the lease, but within your franchise agreement it makes it very clear that if they breach their franchise agreement, is that you can step into their store and operate it, and they are then obliged to do everything that they can to transfer the lease back into your name. That certainly will have more complications than if you were on the head lease yourselves, but is another protection to you. Okay, so let's now move on to negotiating the lease with the landlords or with the landlord's agents. In many respects it's easier if you're only dealing with the landlord, but they tend to be far and few between. They tend to be independents. So if you're going to a location that's potentially just got individual properties and might be owned by small property owners or pensions, then you may be able to deal with them direct, but on the whole you're normally dealing with an agent. Bear in mind that agent is trying to get the best possible deal for his client, not just for his client but for himself, because invariably they are paid commission. So for instance, they may get 10%. So if they can push it up to 50,000 as opposed to 40,000, then they're going to make more money. So bear that in mind. Normally the starting position is, rule of thumb, whatever it's advertised for, you can pretty much be certain that the agent has already built in 10% leeway there. So he will probably come down 10%. If you can push it down any more on that, then you're probably doing well. But that's a good starting place. Avoid premiums. We don't pay any premiums on any of our properties. If they insist on premiums, it's normally because they believe it's in a very good area and that the lease is worth a premium in itself. Or you're buying an existing lease from a company and they feel there's value in it. Like I said, we don't pay premiums. We wouldn't do that. It would make our business unviable. So personally, I don't recommend those. Rent-free periods are common, and with the state of the high street at the moment, you should be able to negotiate some very, very attractive rent-free periods. You may even get 12 months, you may even be able to get more, but certainly a minimum rent-free period is probably 3 months. That's probably in an area that has got high demand, and therefore the landlord's quite confident that he doesn't need to give you any more than that. Another potential thing for you to look at is staggering rent increases. So if the landlord is only comfortable with giving you 3 months because they need to see a revenue coming in themselves, they've got mortgages to pay, etc., etc., you may be able to go, look, okay, we'll have 3 months rent free, but the next 6 months we'll only pay at half rent. Or potentially, if they're really, really struggling in terms of they've got their own commitments. It may be that you turn around and say, okay, no rent-free period at all, but we'll have 12 months at half rent. That way they get some money coming in all the time, and you get an extended period of rent-free, but at a lower monthly payment. So everyone's kind of happy there. You're paying out a little bit more than you would hope to initially, but you're getting a reduction in the rent for a longer period. And the landlord's happy because he's seen some income coming in from it. There's also the potential of financial contributions from the landlord. If the property is in particularly bad condition, or they've had it on their books for a long time, there may be the potential for the landlord to contribute towards the shop fit. And I've had those before, and that they can be quite significant. These things are all worth trying. They can only say no to you. So push it out there, see what reaction you get, and you might be surprised. There's also turnover related rents that are based upon a base level rent, and then if your sales exceed a certain figure, you'll pay an additional amount. Now, not very happy with those ones myself. Shopping centres, they're pretty much standard with them. So if you're going into a shopping centre or a food court, the reality is that you have to be prepared that that's what it's going to look like. Another thing for you to bear in mind, and very important, particularly if you are on the lease and you're not getting your franchisee to be on the lease, is to make sure that you have a tenant's break only, and you can negotiate that either maybe 3 or 5 years. So at the worst case scenario is if the business is not operating viably for you, you're stuck on the lease, you know you've only got an exposure for X amount of years to cover those rents. Okay, so obviously your contract, your solicitor will cover a lot of this, but if they don't, these are the sort of things that you need to be looking out for. And equally, things like the making sure that the lease is within the Tenants Act. Not all leases are, particularly with shopping centres, none of them are. But most of the normal ones on the high street, you need to make sure you have protection via the Tenants Act, which basically means that you have a renewable lease. So as long as you stick to the terms and conditions of your existing lease, they are obligated to offer you an extension on the lease when it comes up for renewal. Now, it leaves me just one more point to come to. Schedule of condition. Now, the schedule of condition is particularly important if you're going into a store or going into a property that is quite old. You don't know what condition is going to be behind the plasterboard, behind the floors, etc., etc. Or you may be taking something over and adding value to it because it's in a bad condition, and you're going to be tidying it up and doing all the repairs and making it look really good for your own business. So the schedule of condition will be a series of surveys, taking pictures, showing what it was like when you took it over, and that's the condition that you have to hand it back in. Therefore, if you hand it back in a better condition, then there will be no additional cost for you. If you didn't do a schedule of condition, it may well be that you would have to conduct an awful lot of work and expense at the end of your lease to give that back to the landlord. So it's very, very important that protects you towards the end of your lease. So I think that kind of brings us to the end of that. I did warn you it wasn't the most interesting of subjects, but I hope you found it at least a little bit interesting and of value. Please join me again for the very next episode of The Franchise Entrepreneur.